Every parent knows the crushing weight of watching their child's world crumble because you can't fix it. Jesse Halden felt that weight as he stood with his last $2,000, staring at a flooded garage everyone called worthless. The water had been sitting for months, dark and still. His 10-year-old son Marcus sat in the truck, watching his dad make what looked like the worst decision of his life. The eviction notice was in Jesse's pocket. Their landlord wanted them out in 3 days. This garage wasn't just a gamble with money, it was a father betting everything on hope, when hope was all he had left. But what would Jesse discover beneath all that stagnant water that would change their lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jesse Halden had never imagined his life would come down to a handful of crumpled bills and a prayer. 3 years ago, he'd been a respected mechanic at Morrison's auto shop, the kind of man who could diagnose engine trouble just by listening to the sound a car made when it pulled into the bay. He had steady hands, a good reputation, and a small house on Maple Street, where he and his wife Sarah raised their son Marcus in the kind of quiet contentment that most people take for granted until it's gone. Sarah's death had arrived like a sudden storm, unexpected, devastating, and leaving nothing unchanged in its wake. Cancer, the doctors said, though by the time they found it, medical terms felt as useless as trying to hold back the ocean with your bare hands. She'd fought with the grace and determination that had made Jesse fall in love with her 15 years earlier, but some battles can't be won with willpower alone. The medical bills came first, then the time off work to care for her, then more time off to simply be present for whatever moments they had left. Morrison understood, or at least he tried to, but business was business. When Jesse finally returned to work 6 months after the funeral, his position had been filled by someone younger, someone who didn't carry the weight of grief in his movements or the distraction of single parenthood in his eyes. Now, 18 months later, Jesse sat in his rusted pickup truck outside the county courthouse, watching Marcus color in a book about dinosaurs. The boy had inherited Sarah's thoughtful nature and her way of finding wonder in simple things, but he'd also developed a careful way of watching his father, as if he understood more about their circumstances than a 10-year-old should have to. "Dad, are we really going to buy that garage?" Marcus asked, without looking up from his coloring book. He was working on a triceratops, methodically filling in each section with the precision Sarah had always encouraged in his schoolwork. Jesse pulled out his wallet and unfolded the school photograph he kept there. Marcus grinning at the camera, missing his 2 front teeth, wearing the blue shirt Sarah had picked out for picture day. It had been taken just 2 months before she died, back when life still felt predictable and safe. Now, it served as a reminder of what he was fighting for, what he couldn't afford to lose. "I'm thinking about it," Jesse said carefully. "What do you think?" Marcus looked up from his coloring book, his expression serious in the way children get when they sense adult conversations carrying more weight than usual. "Tommy said it's been underwater for months. He said only someone crazy would buy it." Tommy Reeves had been Jesse's closest friend at Morrison's auto shop, the kind of colleague who became family through shared coffee breaks and weekend barbecues. Even after Jesse lost his job, Tommy had continued checking in, offering small loans and job leads that never quite materialized. His opinion carried weight because he understood cars, understood water damage, and understood how little room Jesse had for mistakes. "Tommy might be right," Jesse admitted, "but sometimes being a little crazy is the only way forward." The courthouse steps were busy with the usual mix of people handling the business of living, young couples filing marriage licenses, older folks dealing with property transfers, lawyers in rumpled suits carrying briefcases that had seen better days. Jesse had become familiar with this building over the past year, handling the paperwork that comes with loss and financial struggle. Mrs. Chen, their landlord, had been patient longer than she had any obligation to be. A widow herself, she understood something about unexpected hardship and the way life could shift beneath your feet without warning. But patience had limits, especially when her own bills needed paying. The eviction notice in Jessie's back pocket represented the end of that patience, folded and refolded until the paper was soft as cloth. "The auction starts in 20 minutes, Jessie said, more to himself than to Marcus. "Last chance to change our minds." Marcus closed his coloring book and looked directly at his father with the kind of steady gaze that reminded Jessie painfully of Sarah. "Do you think Mom would want us to try?" The question hit Jessie harder than he'd expected. Sarah had always been the optimist in their relationship, the one who saw potential where others saw problems. She'd been the one to suggest buying their house when it seemed beyond their reach, the one who'd encouraged Jessie to ask Morrison for the promotion that eventually led to his position as head mechanic. She believed in taking calculated risks when the potential reward justified the uncertainty. "I think," Jessie said slowly, "she'd want us to be smart, but she'd also want us to believe that good things can happen even when everything seems impossible." The garage property had been sitting empty for 8 months, ever since the spring floods that had damaged so much of the lower part of town. Located on Industrial Drive, just past the old railroad crossing, it sat on a corner lot that had once housed Martin Tesla's automotive repair business. No relation to the famous inventor, people always clarified, though Martin had been something of a local legend in his own right. Jessie had driven past the property dozens of times over the years, back when Martin was still alive and the garage was a thriving business. Martin had been particular about his work, the kind of mechanic who treated every car like it deserved his full attention, regardless of its age or value. He'd trained several generations of local mechanics, including Tommy, who still spoke of the old man with the kind of reverence usually reserved for family. The flooding had changed everything. Spring rains had overwhelmed the drainage systems throughout the valley, and the garage, sitting at one of the lowest points on Industrial Drive, had taken the worst of it. By the time the water receded, Martin had already decided he was too old to start over. He'd moved in with his daughter in Phoenix and put the property up for sale. But water damage scared away serious buyers, and the asking price, even reduced twice, remained beyond the reach of anyone willing to take on the restoration project. The property had eventually gone to auction, which was how Jessie found himself here, contemplating spending his last $2,000 on something everyone else considered a lost cause. "Dad," Marcus said quietly, "remember what you told me about fixing things?" Jessie smiled, despite his nervousness. It had become one of their regular conversations over the past year, usually when Marcus was struggling with homework or friends at school. "What did I tell you? You said sometimes the most broken things are worth the most when you fix them right." Tommy's truck pulled into the courthouse parking lot, and Jessie watched his friend climb out with the deliberate movements of someone who'd already worked a full shift but still had energy for whatever came next. Tommy had always been built like a linebacker, broad shoulders, thick hands, and the kind of presence that made people naturally assume he could handle whatever problem needed solving. "You're really going through with this," Tommy said as he approached the truck. "It wasn't a question. Looks that way." Tommy leaned against the passenger door, nodding to Marcus before turning his attention back to Jessie. "I've been thinking about that property all week. Martin knew what he was doing when he set up that garage. The foundation is solid concrete. The electrical was updated just 5 years ago, and the drainage system worked fine until that 100-year flood decided to show up early. But the water damage is bad," Tommy interrupted. "Won't lie to you about that. But it's not impossible, just expensive and time-consuming. The question is whether you're buying a garage or buying time to figure out your next move." Jessie had been asking himself the same question. The practical part of his mind, the part that sounded like his father's voice, insisted this was foolish beyond measure. He had no business buying property when he couldn't afford rent. He had no savings to fall back on, no steady income to support a renovation project, and no experience with the kind of large-scale cleanup that water damage required. But the other part of his mind, the part that sounded like Sarah's encouragement, whispered that sometimes The biggest risks came with the biggest potential rewards. The garage lot was large enough to support not just automotive repair, but maybe even a small used car business. The location, despite the flooding, was still convenient to both the residential areas and the small industrial district that employed half the town. "There's something else," Tommy said, lowering his voice. "I talked to my cousin Jerry. You remember Jerry? He works for the county planning department. He said there's talk about improving the drainage for that whole area. Federal money, part of some infrastructure bill. If that happens, flood risk goes way down, property values go way up." Marcus had been listening to this conversation with the careful attention children pay when adult decisions might affect their world. Now, he spoke up with the directness that sometimes surprised adults. "Tommy, do you think my dad can fix the garage?" Tommy looked at Marcus seriously, understanding that this wasn't a casual question. "Your dad is the best mechanic I ever worked with. If anyone can bring that place back to life, it's him." Jesse felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of doubt he'd carried for months. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was something close to hope, and that felt like progress. The courthouse clock showed 10 minutes until the auction. Jesse looked at the eviction notice one more time, then folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. Some decisions couldn't be made with spreadsheets and careful analysis. Some decisions required the kind of faith that Sarah had always shown in their family's ability to find a way forward. "Marcus," Jesse said, "how do you feel about taking the biggest risk of our lives?" Marcus grinned, and for a moment, Jesse saw Sarah's optimism shining through their son's expression. "I think Mom would say we should go for it." Tommy straightened up and headed toward the courthouse entrance. "Well then, let's go buy ourselves a garage." The courthouse auction room smelled of old wood and nervous anticipation. Jesse sat in the third row with Marcus beside him, watching as the auctioneer shuffled through papers and adjusted his microphone. Only 7 other people had shown up, a mix of curiosity seekers and bargain hunters who probably knew something Jesse didn't about why this particular property had attracted so little interest. "Property number 14, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Industrial Drive Garage and Lot, previously operated as Tesla Automotive Repair. Water damage from spring flooding, sold as is, no warranties or guarantees." Jesse's heart hammered against his ribs as he raised his hand for the opening bid. 2,000. An older man in a worn flannel shirt looked back at Jesse with something between pity and bewilderment. A woman with a clipboard whispered something to her companion that made them both shake their heads. Jesse understood their reaction. Buying a flooded property with his last dollars looked like either desperation or foolishness. And honestly, he wasn't sure there was much difference between the two. 2,000, do I hear 2,500? The auctioneer's eyes swept the room hopefully, but no other hands went up. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 12 for $2,000. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Jesse stared at the auctioneer, processing the reality that he'd just become a property owner. Marcus squeezed his father's hand and whispered, "We did it, Dad." 30 minutes later, Jesse held the garage deed in hands that trembled slightly, despite his best efforts to stay calm. The document felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibility and responsibility in equal measure. Marcus studied the official seal with the fascination children reserve for important adult paperwork. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked as they walked back to the truck. "Now we go see what we bought." The drive to Industrial Drive took less than 10 minutes, but Jesse felt like he was traveling much farther than the physical distance suggested. Every familiar landmark, the grocery store where Sarah had shopped, the elementary school where Marcus would start 5th grade in the fall, the diner, where Jesse sometimes treated them both to pancakes when money allowed, seemed to be watching their journey with careful attention. The garage sat at the corner of Industrial Drive and Maple Street, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better days. Even from the street, Jesse could see the waterline on the building's exterior walls, a dark stain that marked how high the flood had reached. The parking lot, cracked and uneven, still held shallow puddles from the previous night's rain. Tommy's truck was already parked outside the fence, and Jesse could see his friend pacing near the building's entrance with the nervous energy of someone who wanted to be helpful but wasn't sure how. "Thought you might want some moral support," Tommy said as Jesse and Marcus climbed out of their truck. "Plus, I brought some things you're going to need." He gestured toward the bed of his truck, which contained a battery-powered lantern, a pair of hip waders, work gloves, and what looked like a small pump. "Figured you'd want to see what you're dealing with before dark." Jesse fumbled with the key ring the courthouse had given him, trying 3 different keys before finding the one that opened the padlock securing the front gate. The metal hinges protested with a squeal as the gate swung open, revealing a cracked sidewalk leading to the garage's main entrance. The building itself was larger than Jesse had remembered from driving past over the years. Single-story, built from concrete block with a flat roof, it had the practical, no-nonsense appearance of a structure designed for work rather than aesthetics. 2 large bay doors dominated the front facade, with a regular entrance door positioned between them. Windows lined the upper portion of the walls, most still intact despite the flooding. "Ready?" Tommy asked, offering Jesse the hip waders. Jesse pulled on the rubber boots, their weight unfamiliar against his legs. Marcus stayed close as they approached the main entrance, his excitement gradually giving way to uncertainty as the reality of the situation became clear. The door opened easily, but the smell hit them immediately, the musty organic odor of standing water mixed with rust, mold, and something else Jesse couldn't identify. Tommy's lantern cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that was somehow both better and worse than Jesse had imagined. The water was perhaps 18 inches deep, dark as coffee and perfectly still. It reflected the lantern beam like a mirror, creating the strange illusion that they were looking down into a second garage, suspended upside down beneath the first. Debris floated on the surface, pieces of insulation, what looked like automotive parts and unidentifiable objects that had been transformed by months of soaking into shapeless masses. "Oh, wow," Marcus whispered, and Jesse couldn't tell if the boy's tone carried more wonder or worry. Tommy waded in first, testing the depth and the stability of the floor beneath the water. "It's solid," he reported, "and not as deep as I expected. The pump should be able to handle this." Jesse followed his friend into the dark water, feeling the cold penetrate the waders despite their protection. Each step required careful placement to avoid slipping on the submerged floor, and he kept one hand extended toward Marcus, who remained safely on the threshold. As Tommy's light moved around the space, Jesse began to make sense of what he'd purchased. The garage's basic layout was still intact, 2 service bays with hydraulic lifts that disappeared beneath the waterline, a customer waiting area near the front entrance, and what appeared to be an office space behind glass windows that had somehow remained unbroken. Along the walls, Jesse could make out the shapes of tool cabinets, parts shelves, and equipment that had been submerged but not necessarily destroyed. A large workbench dominated one corner of the space, its surface just visible above the water level. "The electrical shot," Tommy said, playing his light across junction boxes and outlets that showed clear signs of water damage. "But that was probably the first thing the insurance company flagged anyway. Everything else," he paused, considering, "everything else might be salvageable with enough time and elbow grease." Jesse felt a strange mixture of intimidation and excitement as he surveyed his new property. The scale of the cleanup was enormous, far beyond anything he'd tackled before. But underneath the water damage and neglect, he could see the bones of what had once been a well-organized, efficient workspace. "Dad," Marcus called from the doorway, "there's something weird over here." Jesse and Tommy waded back toward the entrance, where Marcus was pointing at a section of the wall near the office area. Tommy directed his light where the boy indicated, revealing a series of framed certificates and photographs that had somehow survived the flooding. Most were positioned high enough on the wall to have escaped water damage, creating an unexpected gallery of Martin Tesla's professional history. Jesse studied the certificates, business licenses, automotive certifications, and what appeared to be some kind of engineering credentials from decades earlier. The photographs showed the garage in its prime, with classic cars in various stages of repair, and Martin himself, a thin man with careful eyes and hands that seemed to always be holding some kind of tool. "Look at this one," Tommy said, directing the light toward a photograph that showed Martin standing beside what appeared to be an unusual vehicle, sleek, oddly proportioned, and unlike anything Jesse recognized from standard automotive production. "What do you think that is?" Marcus asked. Tommy studied the image for a long moment. "I have no idea, but Martin always was working on something unusual. He had a reputation for taking on projects that other mechanics wouldn't touch." Jesse felt a sudden weight of responsibility settling over him like a heavy coat. This wasn't just a building he'd purchased, it was the culmination of another man's life's work, the physical representation of decades of craftsmanship and dedication. Martin Tesla had built something meaningful here, and now Jesse was tasked with either restoring it or watching it deteriorate beyond recovery. "We should head back," Tommy said as the daylight outside began to fade. "You've got a big decision to make about how to tackle this." As they secured the building and prepared to leave, Jesse took one last look at the flooded garage. The water that had initially seemed like an insurmountable obstacle now felt more like a temporary condition, something that could be addressed with the right tools and enough determination. Marcus climbed into the truck and immediately began talking about everything they'd seen, his earlier uncertainty replaced by the kind of excitement children feel when presented with an enormous project. "Dad, when we get all the water out, can we fix up those old cars in the pictures?" Jesse started the engine and pulled away from the garage, watching it disappear in his rearview mirror. "One step at a time, son. First, we drain the water. Then we see what we're really working with." But as they drove home through the familiar streets of their small town, Jesse found himself thinking about Martin Tesla's unusual vehicle in that old photograph. Something about it had captured his attention in a way he couldn't quite explain, as if it represented possibilities he hadn't yet considered. The eviction notice was still in his pocket, but for the first time in months, it felt like just a piece of paper rather than a sentence of doom. He'd taken the leap, made the gamble, and committed himself to a path that led somewhere other than surrender. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Jesse arrived at the garage at dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. The morning air was crisp with early autumn, and the low sunlight made the building look less intimidating than it had the day before. Marcus was still asleep when Jesse left the house, curled under the blanket Sarah had made for him, trusting his father to handle whatever came next. The padlock opened more easily this time, as if the building recognized its new owner. Jesse had spent most of the night making lists, what needed to be done first, what tools he'd need, how to prioritize tasks that all seemed equally urgent. The sump pump Tommy had mentioned was his first priority, but rentals cost money Jesse couldn't spare, and buying one was completely out of the question. He'd worn his oldest clothes and brought a pair of rubber boots that had seen him through previous home repair projects. They weren't proper waders, but they'd have to do. The real work began with assessment, understanding exactly what he was dealing with before making any decisions about how to proceed. Inside the garage, the water seemed even darker in the morning light, filtering through the windows. Jesse picked up a piece of rebar from near the entrance and began probing the depth more systematically than they'd managed the day before. 18 inches near the front doors, nearly 2 feet toward the back of the building where the floor sloped slightly downward. He was measuring the dimensions of the space when Tommy's truck pulled up outside. Through the open door, Jesse watched his friend unload equipment from the truck bed with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd planned this carefully. "Figured you could use some help," Tommy called as he approached the entrance, dragging what was unmistakably a gasoline-powered sump pump behind him. "My brother-in-law works construction, and he owed me a favor. This thing will have your place drained by noon." Jesse stared at the pump, understanding that this represented more than just borrowed equipment. This was Tommy's way of investing in Jesse's success, of putting his own reputation behind his friend's decision. The gesture carried weight that went beyond the practical value of the machinery. "Tommy, I can't pay you back for this right now." "Who said anything about paying me back?" Tommy was already examining the pump's connections, checking fuel levels, and testing the pull cord. "You'd do the same for me. Besides, I want to see what's under all this water." Martin always claimed he had some interesting projects back there. The pump started on the third pull, its engine settling into a steady rhythm that filled the garage with purposeful noise. Tommy positioned the intake hose in the deepest section of the standing water and ran the discharge line out through the front door, where it would empty into the storm drain at the street. "This is going to take a while," Tommy said over the engine noise, "but we should start seeing progress pretty quick." Jesse had never realized how satisfying it could be to watch water being moved from where it didn't belong to where it did. Within the first hour, the pump had lowered the water level enough to reveal the tops of the hydraulic lifts, and Jesse began to see the actual floor of the garage for the first time since the flooding. The concrete was stained but intact, marked with decades of automotive work, oil stains, scuff marks from equipment, and the kind of wear patterns that spoke of consistent, professional use. As more of the floor became visible, Jesse could trace the organization Martin had imposed on the space. Tool cabinets were positioned for maximum efficiency, parts storage was arranged logically by frequency of use, and everything showed the careful planning of someone who understood how workspace layout affected productivity. "Look at this," Tommy said, pointing to a section of floor where the receding water had revealed a sophisticated drainage system. Martin built channels right into the concrete. "That's why the water's not draining naturally. The drains are probably clogged with debris, but the infrastructure is solid." By mid-morning, Marcus had arrived, having walked the 12 blocks from their house to the garage. Jesse had given him permission to come by after finishing his Saturday chores, and the boy appeared with the kind of eager energy that made everything seem possible. "Dad, you can see the floor." Marcus's excitement was infectious, and Jesse found himself grinning despite the magnitude of work that remained. "Pretty amazing what happens when you drain away what doesn't belong," Jesse replied, then caught himself at the metaphor. Sometimes life offered lessons in the most unexpected places. As the water level continued dropping, more of the garage's contents became visible. What had seemed like random debris floating on the surface revealed itself as recoverable equipment, toolboxes, parts bins, and automotive supplies that might be salvageable once cleaned and dried. Tommy pulled a dripping carburetor from a parts bin, examining it with professional interest. "Most of this stuff just needs cleaning. Martin always bought quality tools, and quality lasts. You might end up with a completely equipped shop for the price of cleanup and some replacement parts." Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway around noon, carrying a paper bag that smelled of fresh sandwiches. Jesse's landlord had the careful bearing of someone who'd learned to be cautious about hope, but her presence here suggested she was keeping track of his progress with more than casual interest. "Thought you might be hungry," she said simply, offering the bag to Jesse, "and I wanted to see how the cleanup was going." Jesse accepted the sandwiches gratefully, realizing he hadn't eaten since the previous evening. Mrs. Chen studied the garage interior with the practiced eye of someone who'd owned rental property for decades, assessing both damage and potential. "My late husband would have liked this," she said after a long moment. "He always said the best investments were the ones that scared away the competition." "Does that mean you're not going to evict us?" Marcus asked, with the directness that sometimes made adults uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen smiled at the boy with genuine warmth. "Let's see what your father accomplishes here. Sometimes people surprise you with what they can do when they have to." The afternoon brought steady progress as the pump continued its work. Jesse and Tommy began removing debris and assessing what could be saved. Much of the smaller equipment would need thorough cleaning, but the major pieces, the hydraulic lifts, the air compressor, even the large workbench, appeared to be fundamentally sound. The electrical system will need complete replacement, Tommy said, examining junction boxes and outlets that showed obvious water damage. But that's not necessarily bad news. Gives you a chance to upgrade everything to modern standards. Marcus had appointed himself official finder of interesting objects, and he approached this responsibility with the seriousness children bring to important tasks. He discovered a vintage automotive manual that had been stored high enough to escape water damage, a collection of specialized tools Jesse didn't recognize, and what appeared to be engineering drawings protected in a waterproof case. "Dad, look at this," Marcus called from the office area, holding up a framed photograph that showed Martin Tesla shaking hands with someone in what appeared to be a formal ceremony. "Do you think Martin was famous?" Jesse studied the photograph, noting the official appearance of the setting and the quality of both men's clothing. "I think Martin might have been more accomplished than people around here realized." As the sun began to set, the garage looked transformed. The pump had done its work, leaving only puddles in the lowest areas and revealing the full scope of both damage and potential. What had seemed impossible that morning now felt merely difficult, a significant distinction that made all the difference in Jesse's growing confidence. Tommy shut off the pump and began coiling hoses with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. "Tomorrow you can start the real cleanup. Get some fans in here to help with drying. Maybe rent a power washer for the walls and floor. This place is going to clean up better than you expected." As they prepared to leave, Jesse took a moment to appreciate what they'd accomplished. The garage was no longer underwater, and that simple fact changed everything about how he thought about the project. What had been abstract and overwhelming now felt concrete and manageable. Marcus walked beside him toward the truck, chattering about everything they'd discovered and everything they still needed to do. His enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Jesse of Sarah's ability to find excitement in new challenges. "Dad," Marcus said as they reached the truck, "do you think we're really going to make this work?" Jesse looked back at the garage, its windows reflecting the last light of day. "You know what I think? I think we already started making it work." 2 weeks of steady work had transformed the garage from a waterlogged disaster into something that resembled its former purpose. Jesse arrived each morning before sunrise and stayed until Marcus finished school, developing calluses on his hands and a routine that felt more satisfying than any job he'd held in recent memory. The power washer rental had been worth every dollar, stripping away months of water damage and revealing concrete walls that were structurally sound despite their stained appearance. Jesse had learned to work with the building's natural drainage system, unclogging the floor drains that Martin had ingeniously built into the concrete decades earlier. Marcus had become an essential part of the operation, arriving each afternoon with homework completed and ready to help with whatever task didn't require adult-sized strength. His job was organizing the salvaged tools and parts they'd recovered, and he approached this responsibility with the methodical patience he'd inherited from his mother. "Dad, look what I found." Marcus called from behind the main workbench, holding up a wooden toolbox that had somehow stayed dry during the flooding. "It was up on that high shelf, and there's a whole bunch of stuff inside." Jesse wiped his hands on a rag and joined his son behind the workbench. The toolbox was clearly handmade, constructed from what appeared to be walnut, with brass fittings that had been maintained despite decades of use. When Marcus opened the lid, Jesse found himself looking at a collection of tools, unlike anything he'd seen in a standard automotive shop. These weren't the mass-produced implements most mechanics used, but precision instruments that appeared to have been crafted for specific purposes. Calipers with markings Jesse didn't recognize, measuring devices that seemed designed for tolerances far beyond normal automotive work, and several tools he couldn't identify at all. "This is interesting," Jesse said, lifting a tool that resembled a combination of protractor and compass. "Martin wasn't just fixing cars in here." Tommy's arrival interrupted Jesse's examination of the mysterious tools. His friend had been stopping by every few days to check on progress and offer assistance with tasks that required two people. Today, he carried a bag from the hardware store and wore the expression of someone who had news to share. "I've been asking around about Martin," Tommy said without preamble. "Turns out there's more to that story than anyone around here knew." Jesse and Marcus gathered around as Tommy unpacked his purchases, replacement parts for the air compressor, electrical supplies, and what appeared to be a bottle of specialized cleaning solution. "My cousin Jerry, the one who works for the county, he did some research for me. Apparently Martin Tesla had engineering degrees from two different universities, mechanical and electrical. He worked for some big companies back east before he moved here and opened the garage." "What kind of companies?" Jesse asked, his curiosity growing. "Defense contractors, mostly. Some automotive manufacturers. But here's the interesting part. He held several patents. Not for car repair stuff, but for electrical systems and some kind of experimental motor design." Marcus had been listening with the focused attention children give to adult conversations that might affect their world. "So Martin was like an inventor?" "More than that," Tommy continued. "I found some old newspaper articles at the library. Back in the 80s, there were stories about Martin working on some kind of electric vehicle project. This was way before electric cars became popular, understand. He was ahead of his time." Jesse felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit together. The unusual tools, the engineering credentials, the sophisticated workspace hidden behind the facade of a simple automotive repair shop. Martin Tesla had been conducting serious research in this garage, research that might have implications Jesse was only beginning to understand. "The question is," Tommy said, "what happened to all that experimental work? If Martin was developing electric vehicle technology 30 years ago, where are his prototypes? Where are his notes and designs?" As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Chen appeared in the garage entrance. Jesse had grown accustomed to his landlord's periodic visits, understanding that she was tracking his progress with the combination of hope and skepticism that comes with experience. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said, approaching the group with careful steps across the still-drying concrete floor. "You're talking about Martin's special projects. You knew about his engineering work?" Jesse asked. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Martin and my husband were friends for many years. They served together in the army, back before either of them married. Martin always said he came here to get away from the complications of big city engineering, but he never stopped inventing." She gestured toward the back section of the garage, where Jesse had been focusing most of his cleanup efforts. "He used to work on something back there, behind that partition wall. My husband helped him move equipment sometimes, but Martin was very private about his research, said it wasn't ready for public attention." Jesse looked toward the area Mrs. Chen indicated, realizing he'd been so focused on the general cleanup that he hadn't paid careful attention to the garage's layout. What he'd assumed was simply a storage area might actually be a separate workspace, possibly containing whatever remained of Martin's experimental projects. "Mrs. Chen," Marcus said with the directness that consistently surprised adults, "do you think Martin left his inventions here when he moved away?" The older woman considered the question carefully. Martin was 93 years old when he decided to move to Phoenix. His daughter was worried about him living alone, and the flooding gave him a reason to finally give up the garage. But he was also very concerned about his life's work being lost or misunderstood. "What do you mean?" Jesse asked. "He said once that he'd spent 40 years developing ideas the world wasn't ready for, but someday the right person would find his work and understand its value. He said he was leaving everything exactly where it belonged, waiting for someone who would appreciate what he'd accomplished." Jesse felt a chill of anticipation. If Martin had indeed left behind decades of experimental work, the value of Jesse's purchase might extend far beyond the building and basic equipment. But it also meant he was now responsible for preserving and potentially continuing work he didn't yet understand. Tommy was already moving toward the back area, his mechanic's curiosity overriding any concerns about trespassing on Martin's privacy. "Jesse, you need to see this partition wall. It's not just dividing the space, it's hiding it." Jesse and Marcus followed Tommy to the rear section of the garage, where what Jesse had assumed was a simple room divider revealed itself as something more sophisticated. The partition was constructed from the same concrete block as the exterior walls, but it featured a door that had been concealed behind a movable tool cabinet. "How did we miss this?" Jesse asked, helping Tommy shift the cabinet away from the door. "Because Martin wanted it missed," Tommy replied. "This wasn't just storage, this was a private workshop." The door opened with surprising ease, revealing a space that took Jesse's breath away. Where the main garage showed the wear and water damage of recent months, this hidden workshop remained exactly as Martin had left it. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with electronic equipment, measuring instruments, and what appeared to be components for vehicles, unlike anything Jesse had seen. But it was the center of the room that captured everyone's attention. Covered by a heavy canvas tarp and elevated on a platform to protect it from potential flooding, something large and vehicle-shaped waited in the shadows. "Dad," Marcus whispered, "what do you think it is?" Jesse approached the covered object with the reverence he might show a museum exhibit. The tarp was secured with ropes, but they were tied in simple knots that suggested Martin had expected someone to eventually uncover his work. "Only one way to find out," Jesse said, beginning to untie the first rope. Mrs. Chen watched from the doorway with an expression that mixed anticipation and concern. Martin always said his greatest achievement was something the world wasn't ready to understand. He said it would take the right person, someone who believed in possibilities instead of limitations. As Jesse pulled away the canvas tarp, late afternoon sunlight, streaming through the workshop's single window, illuminated what Martin Tesla had spent decades creating. What emerged was unlike anything Jesse had ever seen: sleek where cars were boxy, efficient where they were wasteful, and beautiful in a way that suggested form had followed function to its logical conclusion. It was clearly a vehicle, but one designed according to principles that conventional automotive engineering had never embraced. Jesse found himself looking at Martin Tesla's vision of what transportation could become, preserved like a message in a bottle for whoever would eventually understand its significance. "My God," Tommy whispered. "Do you know what this is?" Jesse couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Martin Tesla's mysterious vehicle waiting in the hidden workshop, its streamlined form suggesting technologies and possibilities he couldn't begin to understand. He'd covered it again before they left the garage, but the image remained burned into his memory with the clarity of something that would change everything. Marcus had been unusually quiet during dinner, pushing food around his plate while clearly processing what they'd discovered. Finally, he'd looked up at his father with the serious expression he wore when wrestling with important questions. "Dad, do you think Martin left that car for us to find?" Jesse had considered the same question. The timing seemed too convenient. A struggling mechanic discovers exactly the kind of breakthrough that could transform his circumstances. But life sometimes offered coincidences that felt like destiny, and Jesse was beginning to believe this might be one of them. Now, at 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and drove back to the garage. The building looked different in the darkness, more mysterious and full of potential than it appeared during daylight hours. Jesse let himself in quietly, as if he might disturb something sacred. The hidden workshop felt like a cathedral in the darkness. Jesse clicked on his flashlight and approached the covered vehicle, pulling back just enough of the tarp to see the sleek lines and unusual proportions that had captured his imagination. In the flashlight beam, details became visible that he'd missed in his earlier excitement. The vehicle's surface wasn't painted metal, but something that looked like molded composite material, decades before such manufacturing techniques became common in automotive production. The wheels were smaller than conventional car wheels, but wider, suggesting considerations of efficiency over traditional aesthetics. Most intriguingly, Jesse could see no obvious exhaust pipe, no air intake for a combustion engine, no external features that suggested conventional propulsion. He spent an hour examining what he could see without disturbing the tarp too much, taking mental notes of construction details that defied his understanding of automotive engineering. This wasn't a modified car, it was something designed from the ground up, according to principles Jesse didn't recognize. When he finally returned home, dawn was breaking over the quiet streets of their neighborhood. Marcus was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with cereal and homework, but Jesse could tell his son's attention was elsewhere. "Did you go back to look at it?" Marcus asked, without looking up from his math problems. "How did you know?" "You get a certain look when you're thinking about something important. Mum used to say you looked like you were trying to solve the world's problems all by yourself." Jesse poured coffee and joined his son at the table. Sarah had indeed understood his tendency to carry the weight of decisions privately, working through possibilities and complications before sharing his conclusions with anyone else. But this situation felt too big for solitary analysis. "Marcus, what would you think about asking some experts to help us understand what Martin built?" Marcus looked up from his homework with immediate interest. "Like who?" "I don't know yet. Maybe someone from the university engineering department or a museum that specializes in automotive history. People who would know about electric vehicles and experimental technology. But what if they want to take it away from us?" The question revealed Marcus's growing attachment to their discovery, and Jesse understood his son's concern. They'd found something extraordinary, but they didn't yet know what legal or ethical obligations came with that discovery. If Martin's vehicle represented significant historical or technological value, other people might have legitimate claims to it. "We'll be careful about who we talk to," Jesse promised, "but we need help understanding what we have before we make any decisions about what to do with it." Tommy arrived at the garage earlier than usual that morning, carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd also spent the night thinking about their discovery. He'd brought his laptop computer, something Jesse rarely saw him use outside of work situations. "I stayed up researching," Tommy said without preamble. "Electric vehicles, Martin Tesla's patents, experimental automotive technology from the 80s and 90s. Jesse, I think we stumbled onto something historically significant." Jesse and Marcus gathered around as Tommy opened his laptop and began showing them what he'd learned. Patent filings in Martin's name dating back 30 years, academic papers he'd published on electric motor design, and references in automotive journals to experimental work being conducted by an independent researcher. "Look at this," Tommy said, pointing to a newspaper article from 1987. Martin was interviewed about his electric vehicle research, and he claimed he'd solved problems that the major manufacturers were just beginning to recognize. Range, charging time, manufacturing cost, he said he'd developed solutions that were decades ahead of current technology. Marcus leaned closer to the computer screen, studying photographs that showed a younger Martin standing beside equipment Jesse now recognized from the workshop. "So he really was a famous inventor." "Not famous exactly," Tommy continued, "but respected in certain circles. The problem was that his research was so far ahead of the market that nobody was ready to invest in production. Electric vehicles were considered impractical curiosities, and Martin couldn't find backing for large-scale development." Jesse studied the articles with growing amazement. Martin Tesla had been conducting exactly the kind of research that major corporations were now spending billions to develop. If his experimental vehicle incorporated solutions to problems the automotive industry was still struggling with, its value extended far beyond historical curiosity. "There's something else," Tommy said, pulling up another document. "I found references to Martin's work in some recent academic papers. Researchers at several universities have been trying to recreate some of his motor designs based on his published patents. Apparently, his approaches to efficiency and power management were revolutionary." A new voice interrupted their research session. "May I ask what you gentlemen are discussing?" Jessie looked up to see Dr. Elizabeth Morrison standing in the garage entrance, wearing the kind of practical clothes that suggested she'd come prepared for industrial environments. He recognized her name from the university's engineering department, though he'd never met her personally. "Dr. Morrison," Tommy said, clearly surprised. "What brings you here?" "Your research, actually. I have alerts set up for any mention of Martin Tesla's work, and your internet searches last night triggered several of them. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I've been trying to locate Martin's experimental data for several years." Jessie felt a moment of panic. Their discovery was less than 24 hours old, and already outside experts were appearing. But Dr. Morrison's demeanor suggested scientific curiosity rather than any attempt to claim ownership. "What kind of research are you doing?" Jessie asked carefully. "Electric vehicle efficiency, primarily. Martin's published work suggested he'd solved several problems that we're still working on, but his papers were mostly theoretical. We've been hoping to find his actual prototypes or test data to verify his claims." Marcus looked at his father with wide eyes, understanding that their secret had just become significantly more complicated. Jessie made a quick decision based on instinct rather than careful analysis. "Dr. Morrison, would you be willing to sign a confidentiality agreement before we show you what we found?" Her face lit up with the kind of excitement academics usually reserve for major discoveries. "You found Martin's experimental vehicle." "We found something," Jessie said carefully, "but we need to understand what we have before we make any decisions about what to do with it." Tommy had been watching this exchange with the practical concern of someone who understood that academic interest could quickly become legal complications. "Doc, before we go any further, we need to establish what happens if this thing turns out to be as significant as you think it is." Dr. Morrison nodded seriously. "I understand your concerns. Martin's work could indeed be extremely valuable, both historically and commercially. But I'm a researcher, not a treasure hunter. My interest is in understanding his innovations, not in claiming ownership." Jessie looked at Marcus, who nodded with the trust children sometimes show when adults ask for their opinion on important matters. "All right, Dr. Morrison, let's see what Martin Tesla left for us to find." Dr. Morrison's reaction to Martin's hidden workshop exceeded even Jessie's expectations. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, taking in the sophisticated equipment and organized research materials with the reverence of someone discovering a lost library. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, approaching the workbenches with careful steps. "I've seen photographs of similar setups in corporate research facilities, but never in an independent workshop." Martin was conducting university-level research with equipment that must have cost a fortune. Jessie watched as Dr. Morrison examined the tools and measuring instruments Marcus had discovered weeks earlier. Her familiarity with the equipment was obvious, and she handled each piece with the confidence of someone who understood both its purpose and its value. "These aren't standard automotive tools," she explained to Marcus, who was following her progress with fascination. "These are precision instruments for electrical engineering and prototype development. This calibration device alone would cost more than most people spend on a car." Tommy had remained near the covered vehicle, clearly eager to reveal their most significant discovery. "Doc, that's just the workshop equipment. Wait until you see what Martin built." Jessie helped Tommy pull away the canvas tarp, watching Dr. Morrison's face as Martin Tesla's experimental vehicle emerged into the afternoon light, streaming through the workshop's windows. Her expression progressed through surprise, amazement, and finally, what looked like professional awe. "My God," she breathed, circling the vehicle with the careful attention of someone cataloging every detail. "This is exactly what I hoped we'd find, but better than I dared imagine." The vehicle looked even more impressive in full daylight, with an expert present to appreciate its innovations. Jessie found himself seeing it through Dr. Morrison's eyes, not just as an unusual car, but as the physical embodiment of ideas that had taken decades to develop and implement. "The body construction is advanced composite materials," Dr. Morrison said, running her hand along the vehicle's smooth surface. This predates widespread use of carbon fiber in automotive applications by at least a decade. The aerodynamics are extraordinary. Look at how every surface is designed to minimize drag. Marcus had climbed onto a workbench to get a better view of the vehicle's interior through its transparent roof panels. Dr. Morrison, why doesn't it look like other cars? Because Martin wasn't trying to make it look like other cars, she replied with a smile. He was designing for maximum efficiency, which means form follows function. Every curve, every proportion, every design choice was made to optimize performance rather than meet consumer expectations about automotive appearance. Jesse noticed that Dr. Morrison kept returning to examine the area where a conventional car would have its engine. The vehicle's front section was shorter and more streamlined than normal automotive proportions, suggesting a radically different approach to mechanical layout. The power plant is completely integrated, she explained, noting Jesse's attention. Instead of a large engine requiring significant space, Martin appears to have distributed the propulsion system throughout the vehicle's structure. This is exactly the kind of thinking that automotive engineers are just beginning to explore today. Tommy had been studying the vehicle's undercarriage, using a trouble light to examine components that weren't visible from above. "Doc, come look at this suspension system. I've never seen anything like it." Dr. Morrison joined Tommy beneath the vehicle, and Jesse could hear their excited technical discussion even though he understood only fragments of their conversation. Terms like regenerative dampening and integrated power recovery suggested that Martin's innovations extended far beyond simple electric propulsion. "Jesse," Dr. Morrison called from under the vehicle, "this is extraordinary. Martin didn't just build an electric car, he reimagined the entire concept of what a vehicle could be. This represents integrated systems thinking that's only now becoming common in aerospace applications." As Dr. Morrison continued her examination, Jesse found himself studying the workshop's other contents with new appreciation. The notebooks Marcus had found earlier weren't amateur sketches, but serious engineering documentation. The specialized tools weren't hobbyist equipment, but professional-grade instruments for precision manufacturing. "Dr. Morrison," Jesse said carefully, "what do you think this is worth?" She emerged from beneath the vehicle with oil stains on her clothes and excitement in her eyes. "Worth? That's almost impossible to determine. Historically, this is a unique artifact representing automotive development paths that were abandoned for economic rather than technical reasons. Scientifically, it's a working demonstration of technologies that current manufacturers are spending billions to develop. But in dollars?" Tommy pressed. "If Jesse wanted to sell this thing, what kind of numbers are we talking about?" Dr. Morrison considered the question carefully. To a private collector interested in automotive history, perhaps hundreds of thousands. To a museum with a serious transportation collection, possibly more. But to a manufacturer looking to license Martin's innovations, she paused, studying the vehicle with professional calculation. The patents alone could be worth millions if they're still enforceable. Jesse felt the workshop spinning slightly around him. He'd gambled his last $2,000 on a flooded garage, and now an expert was suggesting he might have accidentally acquired something worth more than he'd ever imagined possible. Marcus seemed to sense his father's overwhelmed reaction. "Dad, does this mean we're rich?" "It means," Jesse said slowly, "that we have some very serious decisions to make." Dr. Morrison spent another hour documenting the vehicle and workshop equipment, taking photographs and making notes with the systematic approach of serious academic research. When she finally prepared to leave, her expression had shifted from excitement to concern. "Jesse, I need to be direct with you about something. Once word of this discovery spreads, and it will spread, you're going to have a lot of people interested in what you've found. Collectors, investors, museum curators, automotive manufacturers, patent lawyers. Some of them will have legitimate interests, but others might try to take advantage of your situation. What do you recommend?" Jesse asked. Get legal advice before you talk to anyone else. Document everything thoroughly. And be very careful about who you trust with information about Martin's work. There are people who would go to considerable lengths to acquire what you've found. As Dr. Morrison drove away, Jesse stood in the workshop doorway with Tommy and Marcus, looking at the vehicle that had just transformed from an interesting discovery into a potentially life-changing asset. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but it was accompanied by something Jesse hadn't experienced in months, hope that extended beyond mere survival. "Dad," Marcus said quietly, "Martin really did leave this for the right person to find, didn't he?" Jesse put his arm around his son's shoulders, understanding that their lives had just taken a turn neither of them could have predicted. "I think he did, son. Now we have to figure out what the right person is supposed to do with it." 3 days after Dr. Morrison's visit, Jesse's quiet world exploded into chaos he never could have anticipated. It started with a phone call at 6 in the morning, waking him from the first decent sleep he'd managed since discovering Martin's vehicle. "Mr. Halden? This is Rebecca Chen from the Automotive Heritage Foundation. I understand you've made a significant discovery related to electric vehicle development." Jesse sat up in bed, instantly alert. He'd been careful about who knew about Martin's workshop, limiting the information to Tommy, Dr. Morrison, and Mrs. Chen. The fact that strangers were calling suggested that word was spreading faster than he'd expected. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Jesse said carefully. "Mr. Halden, we're prepared to make a substantial offer for any materials related to Martin Tesla's experimental work. Perhaps we could meet today to discuss the details." Jesse ended the call without making any commitments, but his phone continued ringing throughout the morning. Collectors, investors, automotive journalists, and people who wouldn't identify themselves clearly but spoke with the urgency of those accustomed to getting what they wanted. By the time Marcus left for school, Jesse had received 15 calls and twice as many text messages. Someone had posted something online. He wasn't sure what or where, but their discovery was clearly no longer a secret. Tommy arrived at the garage looking grim, carrying a newspaper and wearing the expression of someone bearing bad news. "Jesse, we've got a problem," he said, holding up the morning edition of the regional newspaper. The headline read, "Local man discovers legendary electric vehicle prototype." Jesse stared at the article, which included details about Martin's work that he'd never shared with anyone. Photographs of the garage, quotes from unnamed sources, and speculation about the vehicle's value that made his stomach clench with anxiety. "How did they get all this information?" Jesse asked. "That's what I've been trying to figure out, but look at this." Tommy pointed to a paragraph near the end of the article. "They're calling it the Tesla Phoenix, and they're claiming it represents the missing link in electric vehicle development. Jesse, this is national news now." As if summoned by their conversation, a van with television station markings pulled up outside the garage. Jesse watched through the window as a reporter and cameraman climbed out, clearly preparing to document whatever they could access. "We can't let them in," Jesse said, moving to ensure the front door was securely locked. "It might be too late for that," Tommy replied, pointing toward the street where additional vehicles were arriving. "Word is out, and everyone wants a piece of this story." Jesse's phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed Dr. Morrison's number. "Jesse, have you seen the news coverage?" she asked without preamble. "I'm looking at it right now. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Once something like this becomes public, everyone wants to claim a piece of it. You need legal representation immediately before you say anything to anyone else." Jesse watched through the window as more people arrived, some carrying cameras, others looking like serious collectors or investors. His quiet garage had become the center of attention he'd never wanted and wasn't prepared to handle. "Dr. Morrison, can you recommend a lawyer? I'm already on my way with someone who specializes in intellectual property and automotive history. Don't talk to anyone until we get there, and don't let anyone photograph or examine Martin's work." Jesse spent the next hour fielding phone calls and refusing interviews. while Tommy helped him secure the garage and the hidden workshop. They moved Martin's vehicle deeper into the workshop and covered it with additional tarps, but Jesse understood that secrecy was no longer possible. Marcus arrived from school to find the street filled with vehicles and people, his normal quiet walk home transformed into navigation through what looked like a media circus. "Dad, why are all these people here?" Marcus asked, as Jesse let him in through the garage's back entrance. "Because someone told the world about what we found," Jesse replied, trying to keep his voice calmer than he felt. "Does that mean we're in trouble?" "It means everything just got a lot more complicated." Dr. Morrison arrived with a man in his 50s who introduced himself as David Park, an attorney specializing in intellectual property disputes. Park surveyed the scene outside the garage with professional assessment before turning his attention to Jesse and his situation. "Mr. Halden, before we discuss anything else, I need to understand the legal basis for your ownership of both this property and any contents you discovered here." Jesse produced the garage deed and the receipts from the auction, documents that suddenly felt far more significant than they had weeks earlier. Park examined them carefully, making notes on a legal pad. "The property ownership is clear," Park said, "but the question of any intellectual property or patents related to Martin Tesla's work is more complicated. If Martin left behind proprietary designs or research data, other parties might have legitimate claims to that material." "What kind of parties?" Jesse asked. "Anyone Martin worked with professionally, companies that might have funded his research, even his heirs, if they can demonstrate he intended his work to remain private. The fact that he sealed his workshop suggests he had concerns about unauthorized access to his innovations." Tommy had been listening to this conversation with growing concern. "So you're saying Jesse might not actually own what he found?" "I'm saying the ownership is likely to be disputed, especially given the apparent value of Martin's work. We need to establish clear legal title before Mr. Halden makes any decisions about what to do with his discovery." As if to emphasize Park's point, Jesse's phone rang with a call from someone identifying himself as Martin Tesla's nephew. "Mr. Halden, I represent Martin Tesla's estate. We need to discuss the immediate return of any property belonging to our family." Jesse looked at Park, who gestured for him to hand over the phone. "This is David Park, Mr. Halden's attorney. Any claims regarding estate property will need to be submitted in writing with appropriate documentation." The call ended quickly, but Jesse understood that legal challenges were just beginning. What had seemed like an incredible stroke of fortune was becoming a complicated battle he wasn't prepared to fight. "Mr. Park," Jesse said, "I bought this garage with my last $2,000 because I needed a place to work and live. I don't have money for a legal battle." Park nodded understandingly. "Mr. Halden, let me explain something about intellectual property law. If Martin's innovations are as significant as they appear to be, the potential value extends far beyond simple ownership. We're talking about licensing agreements, manufacturing partnerships, and royalties that could continue for decades." He gestured toward the hidden workshop. "What you found isn't just a prototype vehicle, it's the foundation for an entire approach to electric transportation. The right legal strategy could ensure that you benefit from Martin's work while protecting his innovations from exploitation." Jesse felt overwhelmed by the complexity of decisions he'd never imagined having to make. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been avoiding eviction. Now he was being asked to make choices that could affect not just his family's future, but potentially the development of automotive technology. "What do you recommend?" Jesse asked. "First, we document everything thoroughly. Then we establish clear legal title to whatever Martin left behind. Finally, we explore partnerships that maximize both the commercial potential and the historical significance of his work." Marcus had been listening to this adult conversation with the careful attention children pay when they sense their world changing. Now he spoke up with the directness that consistently surprised the adults around him. Mr. Park, what did Martin want to happen to his inventions? Park looked at the boy seriously, understanding that this wasn't a casual question. That's actually the most important question, Marcus. If we can establish Martin's intentions, it becomes much easier to determine how his work should be handled. Mrs. Chen chose that moment to arrive, navigating through the crowd outside with the determined dignity of someone who wouldn't be deterred by chaos. She carried a manila envelope and wore the expression of someone bearing important information. "Jesse," she said, "I think it's time I shared what Martin asked me to keep safe." Mrs. Chen's manila envelope contained documents that changed everything Jesse thought he understood about his situation. As she spread the papers across Martin's workbench, Jesse found himself looking at legal documents that had been prepared with the kind of careful forethought that comes from decades of planning. "Martin gave these to me 6 months before the flooding," Mrs. Chen explained, her voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "He said someday the right person would buy his garage, someone who needed a second chance as much as his inventions needed a second life." The first document was a will, properly notarized and legally witnessed, that left all of Martin Tesla's intellectual property and research materials to whoever demonstrates the wisdom and courage to restore my workshop to working condition. The language was specific enough to have legal weight, but flexible enough to account for circumstances Martin couldn't predict. David Park studied the will with professional interest, making notes as he read. "This is extraordinary." Martin essentially created a contest with ownership of his work as the prize. The legal precedent is unusual, but the documentation appears solid. The second document was even more significant, a detailed letter in Martin's handwriting, explaining his intentions and providing instructions for whoever would eventually discover his work. Jesse read aloud from the letter, his voice carrying increasing amazement. "I have spent 40 years developing technologies the world wasn't ready to accept. Electric vehicles were considered curiosities, efficiency was less important than power, and the environmental consequences of transportation choices seemed irrelevant to most people." Marcus listened intently as his father continued reading. "But I always believed that circumstances would eventually create demand for the innovations I was developing. When that time came, I wanted my work to be available to someone who would use it responsibly, someone who understood that technology should serve people rather than simply generate profits." Tommy had been examining the other contents of Mrs. Chen's envelope, technical drawings, patent applications, and what appeared to be manufacturing specifications. "Jesse, look at this. Martin didn't just build one prototype. He designed an entire production system." Dr. Morrison, who had remained quietly respectful during the document review, now stepped forward with obvious excitement. "May I examine those manufacturing specifications? If Martin solved the production cost problems that have limited electric vehicle adoption, this represents a complete paradigm shift for the automotive industry." As Dr. Morrison and Tommy studied Martin's technical documentation, Jesse continued reading the letter that seemed written directly to him. "The person who finds this work will likely be someone facing difficult circumstances, someone who understands what it means to bet everything on an uncertain future. That person will need to decide whether my life's work becomes a tool for personal enrichment or a contribution to the common good." Park had been taking notes throughout this revelation, and now he looked up with the expression of someone recalculating every assumption. "Mr. Halden, this changes the legal landscape completely. Martin's will and letter establish clear intent regarding ownership and use of his intellectual property, but they also create significant responsibility." "What kind of responsibility?" Jesse asked. "Martin's letter suggests he intended his work to benefit society rather than simply enrich its owner. That's not legally binding, but it establishes moral expectations that could influence how various parties respond to your ownership claims." Jesse's phone had been ringing constantly throughout their document review, but now it buzzed with a text message that made him pause. The message was from someone identifying himself as a representative of Titan Automotive, one of the largest car manufacturers in the world. "Mr. Halden, we are prepared to make an immediate offer of $5 million for all rights to the Tesla electric vehicle prototype and associated intellectual property. We can have contracts ready for signature within 24 hours. Jesse showed the message to Park, who whistled softly at the figure involved. This is exactly what Martin's letter anticipated. Major manufacturers are going to want to acquire his work to control its development and market introduction. $5 million, Marcus said quietly, clearly trying to process the magnitude of money they'd never imagined possessing. Tommy looked up from the technical drawings he'd been studying. "Jesse, there's something else you need to see." Martin's production cost estimates suggest his electric vehicle could be manufactured and sold for less than half the cost of current electric cars, with twice the range and performance. Dr. Morrison nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what my research suggested, but I never dreamed the solutions were this elegant." Martin didn't just improve electric vehicle technology, he fundamentally reimagined how it could work. Jesse's phone rang again, this time with a call from someone representing the Smithsonian Institution's automotive collection. The caller explained that they were prepared to offer permanent exhibition space for Martin's prototype, along with funding for continued research based on his innovations. As Jesse ended that call, another came from a venture capital firm specializing in clean energy technology. They were offering not just money for Martin's work, but partnership in developing it into a commercially viable automotive brand. "Dad," Marcus said, "everyone wants Martin's car." "Not just the car," Park corrected gently. "They want control over the future of electric vehicle development. Martin's innovations could determine which companies dominate the transportation industry for the next 50 years. Mrs. Chen had been listening to this conversation with the careful attention of someone who'd known Martin personally and understood his values. Now she spoke with quiet authority. "Jesse, Martin chose very carefully where to leave his life's work. He could have given it to universities or corporations or government agencies. Instead, he arranged for it to go to someone who would face the same kind of difficult choices he'd faced throughout his career." Jesse looked around the workshop that had become the center of national attention, weighing decisions that seemed impossible to make correctly. The financial offers were beyond anything he'd dreamed possible, but Martin's letter suggested that money hadn't been the old inventor's primary concern. "What would happen," Jesse asked Park, "if I decided to make Martin's innovations freely available instead of selling them to the highest bidder?" Park considered the question seriously. "You'd probably change the world. Electric vehicle technology would advance by decades overnight, environmental benefits would be enormous, and transportation costs would drop dramatically. But you'd also forfeit the financial benefits that could secure your family's future for generations." Tommy had been studying Martin's letter more carefully, and now he pointed to a passage near the end. "Jesse, look at this part. Martin wrote about finding a balance between personal security and social responsibility. He says the right choice isn't necessarily all or nothing." Jesse read the passage aloud. "I hope whoever finds this work will discover ways to benefit personally while ensuring my innovations serve the broader good. Technology belongs to humanity, but inventors deserve to benefit from their contributions to human progress." As afternoon turned to evening, the crowd outside the garage grew larger rather than smaller. News vans from 3 different television stations had arrived, along with representatives from automotive manufacturers, technology investors, and museum curators. Jesse's quiet garage had become ground zero for what was already being called the most significant automotive discovery of the decade. "We need to make a decision soon," Park advised. "The longer we wait, the more complicated this situation becomes. Legal challenges, media pressure, and corporate maneuvering are all going to intensify." Jesse looked at his son, who had spent the day listening to adult conversations about technologies and money beyond his comprehension, but who seemed to understand the essential choice his father faced. "Marcus, what do you think Martin would want us to do?" Marcus considered the question with the seriousness children bring to problems they know are important. "I think Martin would want his inventions to help people, not just make rich people richer. But I also think he'd want us to be okay, so we can take care of his workshop and keep his inventions working." Dr. Morrison had been quietly studying Martin's technical documentation throughout the afternoon, and now she approached Jessie with a proposal that hadn't been discussed. "Jessie, what if there was a third option? What if you could ensure Martin's work benefits everyone while still securing your family's future? I think I know how that might be possible, but it would require trusting some people you've never met before." Jessie felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just his family, but potentially the future of transportation technology. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between financial security, social responsibility, and possibilities he was only beginning to understand. But tonight, he sat in Martin Tesla's workshop with his son, surrounded by innovations that could change the world, and tried to understand what the old inventor had really intended when he decided to trust his life's work to whoever would find it. Jessie slept fitfully that night, waking every few hours to find his mind racing through scenarios and consequences he couldn't fully predict. By 5 in the morning, he gave up on rest and drove to the garage, hoping for quiet time to think before the circus resumed. The street was empty, except for security guards Park had hired to protect the property from overeager journalists and curiosity seekers. Jessie nodded to them as he unlocked the garage, grateful for the temporary peace their presence provided. Inside Martin's workshop, surrounded by innovations that had suddenly become the center of national attention, Jessie finally understood what the old inventor had experienced during decades of working alone on ideas the world wasn't ready to accept. The isolation, the responsibility, the weight of possessing knowledge that could change everything. Marcus arrived at 7, having walked to the garage before school with the determination children show when they sense important events unfolding. He found his father sitting quietly beside Martin's covered vehicle, drinking coffee and studying the letter that explained the old inventor's intentions. "Did you decide what we're going to do?" Marcus asked, settling beside his father with the comfortable intimacy of their shared morning routines. "I think I know what Martin wants us to do," Jessie replied, "but I'm still figuring out how to make it work." Tommy arrived minutes later, carrying newspapers from 3 different cities and wearing the expression of someone who'd been following the story's rapid expansion. The headlines ranged from "Garage Discovery Could Revolutionize Transportation" to "Small-Town Mechanic Finds Billion-Dollar Technology." "Jessie, this is getting bigger by the hour," Tommy said, spreading the newspapers across Martin's workbench. "There are articles about you in automotive magazines, technology journals, even financial papers. Everyone's trying to figure out what happens next." Dr. Morrison appeared in the workshop entrance, accompanied by a woman Jessie didn't recognize, but who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to important meetings. "Jessie, I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Williams from the National Transportation Research Institute. She flew in from Washington specifically to discuss Martin's work." Dr. Williams approached Jessie with professional courtesy that didn't quite conceal her excitement about the situation. "Mr. Halden, I've spent 20 years studying electric vehicle development, and Martin Tesla's innovations represent the breakthrough our industry has been waiting for. But more importantly, they represent an opportunity to transform transportation in ways that serve everyone, not just wealthy consumers." Jessie studied the newcomer carefully, understanding that her presence represented yet another constituency with claims on Martin's legacy. "What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Williams?" "A partnership that honors both Martin's intentions and your rights as the owner of his work. The Research Institute can provide funding, manufacturing connections, and regulatory support to bring Martin's innovations to market quickly and affordably." Park had arrived during this introduction, and now he joined the conversation with the careful attention lawyers pay to proposals that sound too good to be true. What would such a partnership look like in practical terms? Dr. Williams pulled out a briefcase and began extracting documents that had clearly been prepared in advance. We're proposing the creation of the Tesla Innovation Foundation, with Mr. Halden as founding director and primary beneficiary. The foundation would hold all rights to Martin's intellectual property, but would license it under terms that ensure widespread accessibility while generating substantial ongoing revenue. Jesse examined the preliminary agreements Dr. Williams presented, trying to understand the financial and legal implications of what she was suggesting. The numbers were complex, but the basic structure appeared to offer both significant personal benefits and the broad social impact Martin's letter had envisioned. How significant are we talking about? Jesse asked. Conservative estimates suggest the foundation could generate between $50 and $100 million annually in licensing revenue within 5 years. Dr. Williams replied, "Your share, as founding director, would be sufficient to secure your family's future while funding continued research and development." Marcus had been listening to this adult conversation with focused attention, and now he asked the question that had been forming in Jesse's mind. "Dr. Williams, would Martin's inventions still help regular people buy better cars?" Dr. Williams smiled at the boy's directness. "That's exactly the goal, Marcus. Instead of one company controlling Martin's innovations and charging premium prices, the foundation would license the technology to multiple manufacturers, creating competition that benefits consumers." Tommy studied the technical aspects of Dr. Williams' proposal with the practical understanding of someone who'd worked in automotive manufacturing. "This could work, Jesse. Instead of selling Martin's innovations once for a big payment, you'd be creating a system that keeps generating benefits for decades." Jesse's phone buzzed with another message from Titan Automotive, this time raising their offer to $8 million for exclusive rights to Martin's work. The escalating bids suggested that major manufacturers were growing increasingly anxious about losing control of technologies that could transform their industry. "Dr. Williams," Jesse said, "what happens to companies like Titan if we make Martin's innovations widely available?" "They adapt or they fall behind," she replied with professional directness. "That's how technological progress works. The companies that embrace Martin's innovations and use them responsibly will thrive. Those that try to suppress or control them will lose market share to more innovative competitors." Park had been reviewing the foundation proposal with careful legal attention, and now he looked up with cautious optimism. "Mr. Halden, this structure addresses most of the concerns I had about balancing personal benefit with social responsibility. The legal framework is solid, the financial projections are conservative, and the governance structure ensures you maintain significant control over how Martin's work is used." As the morning progressed, Jesse found himself at the center of increasingly intense negotiations. Representatives from 3 major automotive manufacturers had arrived, each offering substantial sums for exclusive access to Martin's innovations. Museum curators proposed exhibitions that would preserve Martin's work for historical study. Technology investors presented partnership proposals that promised rapid commercialization and enormous profits. But it was Marcus who brought the essential question into focus, asking it with the clarity children sometimes achieve when adults become lost in complications. "Dad, which choice would make Martin proud of us?" Jesse looked around the workshop where Martin Tesla had spent decades developing innovations that could benefit everyone, understanding finally what the old inventor had been trying to accomplish. Not just technological advancement, but a model for how such advancement could serve the common good while rewarding those who made it possible. "Dr. Williams," Jesse said, "if we create this foundation, how do we know it will actually honor Martin's intentions instead of just becoming another way for big companies to control new technology?" Dr. Williams had clearly anticipated this concern. The Foundation's charter includes specific requirements for accessibility, affordability, and continued innovation. Any company that licenses Martin's technology must agree to produce affordable versions of their vehicles and contribute a percentage of their profits to further research. The legal structure makes it impossible to use the Foundation as a tool for market control. Jesse felt pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to fit together in ways that might actually work. The Foundation offered financial security without compromising Martin's vision, technological advancement without exploitation, and personal reward balanced with social responsibility. But before he could make such a momentous decision, he needed to be certain he understood all the consequences for his family and for the broader world that would be affected by how Martin Tesla's final innovations were brought into public use. The afternoon brought Jesse's moment of final decision, as representatives from competing interests gathered in the garage for what everyone understood would be the concluding negotiations. The space that had been his quiet refuge just weeks earlier now hosted discussions that would determine the future of electric vehicle development. Titan Automotive had sent their senior vice president of technology acquisition, a woman who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to purchasing whatever innovations her company needed. Her final offer reached $12 million for exclusive rights to all of Martin's work, with additional royalty payments that could extend the total compensation significantly. "Mr. Halden," she said, presenting contracts that had been prepared by teams of corporate lawyers, "this represents immediate financial security for your family and the resources to develop Martin Tesla's innovations properly. Titan has the manufacturing capacity and market reach to bring these technologies to consumers quickly and effectively." Jesse studied the contracts carefully, understanding that this offer represented more money than he'd ever imagined possessing. $12 million would solve every financial concern he'd faced since Sarah's death, provide for Marcus's education and future, and establish security that extended far beyond his family's immediate needs. But the exclusivity clauses troubled him. Titan's offer would give them complete control over how Martin's innovations were developed and marketed, with no guarantees about accessibility or affordability for average consumers. Dr. Williams, representing the Foundation proposal, presented a different vision of Martin's legacy. "Mr. Halden, the Foundation offers something more valuable than immediate wealth, the opportunity to create lasting change that honors Martin's intentions while providing ongoing benefits for your family." The Foundation's financial projections were more complex but potentially more rewarding over time. Instead of a single large payment, Jesse would receive an annual salary as Foundation Director plus a percentage of all licensing revenue generated by Martin's innovations. Conservative estimates suggested this could total more than the Titan offer within 5 years, with continued growth afterward. Marcus sat quietly beside his father throughout these presentations, occasionally asking questions that revealed his understanding of the essential choice they faced. When the Titan representative emphasized the security of their immediate payment, Marcus asked whether Martin had been more concerned with security or with helping people. Tommy provided technical perspective that helped Jesse understand the practical implications of each proposal. "Jesse, if Titan gets exclusive rights, they'll use Martin's innovations to maintain their market position rather than disrupting it. The Foundation approach means multiple companies will compete using Martin's technology, which drives better products and lower prices." Mrs. Chen contributed historical context that carried special weight because of her personal relationship with Martin. Martin Tesla spent 40 years watching big companies ignore or suppress innovations that could benefit everyone. He structured his legacy specifically to prevent that from happening again. As the afternoon progressed, Jesse found himself thinking less about money and more about the kind of man he wanted Marcus to remember his father being. Sarah had always said that character was revealed by choices made under pressure, and Jesse understood that this decision would define not just his family's future, but his own sense of who he was. The Titan representative grew increasingly insistent as she sensed Jesse's reluctance to accept their offer. "Mr. Halden, opportunities like this don't come twice. $12 million represents generational wealth, financial freedom that extends far beyond your own lifetime." But Dr. Williams offered a different perspective on generational impact. "Jesse, the foundation creates a legacy that extends beyond financial benefits. Your son would grow up knowing his father chose to serve the common good while still providing for his family's future." Jesse looked at Marcus, who had been absorbing these adult conversations with the careful attention children pay to decisions that will shape their world. The boy's expression suggested he understood the weight of what was being decided, even if he couldn't fully grasp all the financial and technical complexities involved. "Marcus," Jesse said quietly, "what do you think Martin would want us to choose?" Marcus considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. "I think Martin would want his inventions to help as many people as possible. But I also think he'd want us to be okay, so we can take care of his workshop and make sure his ideas don't get lost." The simplicity of his son's response clarified everything for Jesse. This wasn't really a choice between money and principles. It was a choice between different ways of honoring both Martin's legacy and his family's needs. Jesse stood up, understanding that he'd reached the moment where delay was no longer possible. The representatives from Titan Automotive, the Foundation, and several other interested parties waited for his decision with the focused attention of people whose own futures depended on his choice. "I've made my decision," Jesse announced, his voice carrying the calm certainty that comes from finally understanding the right path forward. The Titan representative leaned forward expectantly, clearly anticipating acceptance of their substantial offer. "I'm going to establish the Tesla Innovation Foundation," Jesse continued, "with the goal of making Martin's technologies available to benefit everyone, not just wealthy consumers or powerful corporations." The room erupted in mixed reactions. Dr. Williams smiled with professional satisfaction and personal relief. Tommy grinned and clasped Jesse's shoulder with obvious pride. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly, her expression suggesting this was exactly what she'd expected from someone Martin had trusted with his life's work. The Titan representative's reaction was less positive. "Mr. Halden, I hope you understand what you're giving up. $12 million in guaranteed compensation versus uncertain future royalties from a foundation that may or may not succeed." Jesse looked at her with the peace that comes from making decisions based on values rather than fear. "Ma'am, I understand exactly what I'm choosing. I'm choosing to honor the man whose work made this opportunity possible and to build something my son can be proud of for the rest of his life." Park stepped forward with the legal documentation needed to formalize Jesse's decision. "Mr. Halden, if you're certain about this choice, we can begin the foundation incorporation process immediately. Dr. Williams has provided the necessary framework, and Mrs. Chen's documentation of Martin's intentions supports the legal structure." As Jesse signed the papers that would create the Tesla Innovation Foundation, he felt Sarah's presence in a way he hadn't experienced since her death. She would have been proud of this choice, proud of his decision to balance family security with social responsibility, proud of the example he was setting for Marcus. Marcus watched his father sign the documents with obvious fascination, understanding that these pieces of paper represented the transformation of Martin's hidden workshop into something that would affect the broader world. "Dad," Marcus said as Jesse completed the final signature, "does this mean we get to keep the garage?" Jesse laughed, realizing that amid all the discussions of millions of dollars and technological revolutions, his son was still thinking about their basic need for a place to live and work. "Yes, son, we get to keep the garage, and we get to turn it into something Martin would be proud of." Dr. Williams began explaining the next steps in establishing the foundation's operations, but Jesse found his attention drifting to the covered vehicle that had started everything. Martin Tesla's final prototype sat quietly under its tarp, waiting to begin its journey from hidden innovation to public benefit. The handshake agreement Jesse made with Dr. Williams that afternoon represented more than a business partnership. It was a commitment to honor innovation while serving the common good, to build wealth while sharing benefit, to secure his family's future while improving possibilities for families everywhere. As the various representatives prepared to leave, Jesse understood that his life had been permanently transformed by a $2,000 gamble on a flooded garage. But more than that, he discovered that sometimes the biggest risks lead not just to personal reward, but to opportunities to make the world a little better for everyone. 6 months later, Jesse stood in what had once been Martin Tesla's flooded garage, watching his son demonstrate the restored electric vehicle to a group of engineering students from the state university. The transformation was complete in ways he couldn't have imagined when he'd first waded into that dark water with nothing but hope and desperation. The garage had been converted into a working museum and research facility, with Martin's original workshop preserved exactly as he'd left it, while the main bay had been equipped with modern tools and equipment for ongoing vehicle development. Glass cases displayed Martin's original patents and research notes alongside contemporary applications of his innovations, creating a bridge between past vision and present reality. Marcus, now 11, and considerably more confident than the worried boy who'd watched his father make impossible decisions, guided the university students through the technical features of Martin's prototype with the easy expertise of someone who'd spent months learning every detail of its construction. "The motor system is completely integrated with the suspension," Marcus explained, pointing to components that had once been mysterious artifacts but were now as familiar to him as bicycle parts. Martin figured out how to make the car generate power while it's driving, not just consume it. Jesse watched his son's presentation with the pride parents feel when their children exceed their expectations. Marcus had not only adapted to their changed circumstances, but had embraced his role as the keeper of Martin's legacy, studying engineering concepts that challenged many adults and approaching the work with genuine passion rather than mere obligation. Tommy approached from the research area, where he'd been working with Dr. Morrison on the next generation of vehicles based on Martin's principles. His friend had become the Foundation's chief technical officer, applying his mechanical expertise to the practical challenges of translating Martin's innovations into mass-producible technologies. "The licensing agreements are working exactly like we hoped," Tommy reported. 4 different manufacturers are now producing vehicles based on Martin's designs, and competition between them is driving prices down while performance goes up. Jesse nodded with satisfaction. The Tesla Innovation Foundation had exceeded even Dr. Price Williams' optimistic projections, generating licensing revenue that had established his family's financial security while funding continued research and development. More importantly, electric vehicles incorporating Martin's innovations were becoming affordable for middle-class families, exactly as the old inventor had envisioned. Mrs. Chen appeared in the museum entrance, carrying a basket that smelled of homemade cookies and wearing the expression of someone bearing good news. At 78, she moved with the careful dignity of age, but her eyes held the brightness of someone who'd lived to see dreams realized. "Jesse, I just received a call from Martin's daughter in Phoenix," she announced. "She wanted me to tell you how grateful the family is for what you've done with his work. She said Martin would be amazed to know that his garage has become a center for the kind of research he always believed was possible." Jesse accepted the cookies gratefully, understanding that Mrs. Chen's regular visits represented more than neighborly kindness. She had become the unofficial guardian of Martin's memory, ensuring that the commercial success of his innovations didn't overshadow the personal values that had motivated his decades of patient research. Dr. Morrison emerged from the workshop area, where she'd been examining Martin's original prototype with a group of automotive historians. The vehicle had become one of the most significant artifacts in transportation history, drawing researchers and visitors from around the world who wanted to understand how one man's vision had transformed an entire industry. Jesse, the Smithsonian has confirmed they want to create a permanent exhibition around Martin's work. Dr. Morrison announced they're proposing a major display that would tell the complete story from his early patents through the garage discovery to the current impact of the Foundation's licensing program. Jesse considered the proposal with mixed feelings. Recognition of Martin's achievements was important, but the old inventor had always preferred working to talking about work, innovation to publicity about innovation. What would Martin think about having his story told in a national museum? Jesse asked Mrs. Chen. She smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd known Martin personally for decades. Martin always said his work spoke for itself, but I think he'd be pleased to know that his story might inspire other inventors to keep working on ideas the world isn't ready for yet. As the afternoon progressed, Jesse found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them from desperation to prosperity, from a flooded garage to a thriving research foundation. The financial security was certainly appreciated. Marcus's college education was guaranteed, their home was paid for, and Jesse had been able to establish a scholarship fund for students interested in sustainable transportation research. But the deeper satisfaction came from knowing they'd honored Martin's intentions while building something that would continue benefiting people for generations. The Foundation's work had accelerated electric vehicle adoption by at least a decade, reduced transportation costs for millions of families, and inspired a new generation of inventors to pursue innovations that served the common good. Marcus finished his demonstration to the university students and joined his father near Martin's original workbench, where the old inventor's tools were displayed alongside photographs showing the garage's transformation from flood-damaged ruin to cutting-edge research facility. "Dad, do you think we made the right choice?" Marcus asked, echoing the question they'd discussed many times over the past months. Jesse looked around the space where Martin Tesla had spent decades developing innovations that would eventually change the world, where he himself had learned that taking risks on broken things, including broken people, could lead to possibilities neither desperation nor hope had imagined. "I think," Jesse said, putting his arm around his son's shoulders, "we made exactly the choice Martin hoped we would make. We took something broken and made it work, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." Tommy joined them at the workbench, carrying the keys to Jesse's newest project, a restored 1960s pickup truck that incorporated Martin's electric innovations with classic automotive styling. The truck represented Jesse's personal integration of past and future, tradition and innovation, exactly the kind of synthesis Martin had always pursued in his own work. "Ready to take the new truck for its first real test drive?" Tommy asked. Jesse accepted the keys with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned that the best rewards come from work that serves purposes larger than personal benefit. The truck was beautiful, efficient, and historically significant, but most importantly, it represented the continuation of Martin's vision rather than simply its preservation. As they prepared to leave the museum for the day, Jesse paused for a moment beside Martin's prototype vehicle, still covered by the same canvas tarp he'd first removed 6 months earlier. The vehicle that had changed their lives remained exactly where Martin had left it. A reminder that some innovations are too important to be moved or sold or claimed by any single person or institution. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat of their new electric truck, chattering about the day's visitors and the engineering problems he wanted to help solve. His excitement about technical challenges and his natural instinct for collaborative problem-solving suggested he'd inherited both his parents' best qualities and Martin's passion for innovation that served everyone. Jesse started the truck with the quiet satisfaction that comes from electric propulsion, understanding that Martin Tesla's vision of clean, efficient, Affordable transportation was finally becoming reality, not through corporate control or government mandate, but through the patient work of people who believed that good ideas belonged to everyone. As they drove through the familiar streets of their small town toward the home Jesse had nearly lost 6 months earlier, he reflected on Martin's final gift, not just the innovations that had secured their future, but the example of how to balance personal success with social responsibility, how to build wealth while sharing benefit, how to honor the past while creating a better future. The flooded garage, that had seemed like the end of everything, had actually been the beginning of possibilities. Neither Jesse nor Martin could have predicted, but both had been wise enough to trust.